Howdy. And welcome back, everybody. Oh my goodness, all the vacations. It's been crazy. Oh my goodness. And for those who are new, just letting you know, some of our kids are off in children's worship right now. They're doing a great job with that. But for those with your kids in here, stay. We're happy you're here. Both are great. So don't worry if from time to time they give a little commentary on my sermon. Not a problem at all. We get a little amen from the 1-year-olds in the group. So, you know, back when I was getting a master's degree in urban planning, I regularly had to drive back and forth from my work near Baytown and Texas Southern, where over in 3rd Ward. And there was this one particular spot on the drive that I eventually came to dread. See, I would follow the directions on my phone, okay? And the map would tell me exactly where to go, and I would follow the route, make the turns, and eventually it would direct me toward the freeway. And then I would arrive at the spot where I was supposed to get on the freeway. Except there was one small problem. There was no on-ramp. It wasn't a closed on-ramp. It wasn't an on-ramp under construction. It wasn't even an old on-ramp that had been torn down. There was nothing there at all. And I would sit there looking at the road saying, this cannot be right. So I'd drive past it, expecting then that surely the map would realize something was wrong and recalculate. Nope. It would reroute me back to that exact same spot. And I'd try again and again and again. And every time the direction would insist, this is where you get on the freeway. And I'd be staring at my phone. There is no freeway entrance here. Why am I talking to you, phone? And I'd report it and again and again. And apparently Apple Maps had decided that this non-existent on-ramp was a hill worth dying on, which is one more reason why I left Apple and got myself a real phone with Android. I'm teasing. Jesus died for Apple users too. Okay. But you know, there is something about that experience that is actually more profound than just my long-standing disagreement with Apple. Because there are some questions for which we simply do not have an answer. There are some things that we just cannot see. Some things we cannot explain. And if we're honest, there are some questions about God that bother us more than almost any others. Because what about the person who has never heard about Jesus? What happens to them? What about someone who was raised from childhood to believe that Christianity is false? What if they never really had an opportunity to understand who Jesus is? What happens to them? What about someone who sincerely wants to know what is true, but never seems to have a genuine opportunity to hear the gospel as it really is? What about the person who believes deeply in mercy, forgiveness, doing what is right, but never understands that mercy and forgiveness that they long for are found in Jesus? What happens to them? And we want an answer. We want God to show us the map. We want to know exactly how and why everything works. We want to understand what happens in every circumstance, how God's judgment works, how His mercy works, and how every person fits into this plan of salvation. And sometimes, despite all of our theological reasoning, we eventually come to a very uncomfortable place. We don't know. And that's hard because we don't like not knowing. Okay? Especially, we don't like it whenever we know the question matters. But here's the thing about not knowing. Not knowing everything does not mean that we know nothing. Not knowing everything does not mean we know nothing. And not having the entire map does not mean that God has given us no direction at all. For the record, I did know where a different on-ramp was to the freeway, and I did know the path to get home after that. Just because something at the beginning was confusing me, that didn't mean I was forever stuck and unable to get where I needed to go. Christians have wrestled with questions like ours for centuries. And sometimes our wrestling can take us to some remarkable territory. We start asking some strange questions. We may ask, perhaps every religion is somehow secretly pointing toward Jesus. Or maybe there's some other path that God provides for people who never hear the gospel. Or maybe there is some intermediate state, some place between places in which people are given another opportunity to come to faith, whether you are or are not a Star Wars fan. And there is a place for recognizing there are things about God's judgment and God's sovereignty that we don't know. That's true. But there's a danger. We can become so fascinated with what God has not revealed that we lose sight of what He has shown us. There's a distinction between what God has revealed and what God has kept hidden. And today, our readings from Romans and Matthew bring us right into that tension. Romans 10 speaks powerfully, as Paul says, the righteousness based on faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven? What is Paul talking about? Why is he suddenly talking about ascending into heaven? What's that mean? He is exposing one of the deepest instincts of the human heart. We want to know what we have to do to get to God. What ladder do I climb? What spiritual achievement do I accomplish? What moral standard do I need to meet? What secret knowledge of God do I discover, or religious system that will get me there? And even this stuff about you have to believe with your heart and confess with your mouth. Are these two different processes? Did I somehow get it all wrong somehow? No, they're not different processes. You believe on the inside and you reflect it on the outside. This whole thing of how do I ascend into heaven, Paul says don't ask that question. Why? Because you don't have to climb up to heaven to find Christ. Christ has come down to you. Paul says, or who will descend into the abyss? Paul, you've got a really terrible travel agent. In other words, don't ask who is going to go down into the depths to bring Christ back up from the dead. Why? Because Christ has already conquered death. He's not there. You don't have to accomplish His resurrection. You don't have to discover some secret route through the kingdom of death. You don't have to invent some alternate way of salvation. You don't have to bring Jesus back from the grave. God has already done it. Christ came down. Christ died. Christ rose already. And now Paul says, the word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. And that's the remarkable thing about the gospel. We are always tempted to think that salvation must be somewhere far away that we got to reach somehow. We imagine that God is hiding Himself at the top of some mountain and we have to climb high enough in our spirituality to find Him. But the gospel says something completely different. God comes to us. Christ comes to us. His Spirit comes to us by His Word. And Paul says, faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the Word of Christ. So when we start asking all these questions about what God might be doing in circumstances that we cannot see, Romans 10 brings us back to what we do know. We know Christ. We know His death. We know His resurrection. We know His promise. We know His word. And we know all the thousands of witnesses who saw what really happened. And we know that Christ has commanded His church to proclaim that gospel. It doesn't mean that we've solved every mystery. It means that maybe we don't have to. Think about the disciples in the gospel reading, okay? This is right after Jesus was, attempting to be alone. Sort of like a parent trying to go to the bathroom and the kids keep banging, let me in, let me in. But all the people came to find Him. And so He helped them. He fed them with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus sends the disciples ahead of Him in a boat. And He stays behind. Imagine being one of those disciples and Jesus says, get in the boat and go. So you go. And you're rowing across the lake, but Jesus isn't with you. At least you don't think He is. and the wind starts fighting against you and the waves are pounding against the boat and it's dark and you start wondering, if only Jesus were here, why did he make us leave without him? He sent us out here. He told us to go, but where is he? How is he even going to get to where we're going? I mean, is he going to walk all the way around the lake? Is he going to take another boat? Is he going to meet us somewhere on the other side? You can imagine the disciples trying to figure all this out. And then in the middle of the night, they see something coming toward them. What appears to be walking on the water. They don't recognize him. If you have been rowing against winds and waves, which are probably kicking up the water to the low point of visibility, then you're probably not going to recognize who it is, because how often do you need to look at a person walking on water? And there's really only one answer that they can come up with. It's a ghost! Like a Terrible Friends episode. And after all this, somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., they're probably exhausted and brain dead after a long day of feeding people and after rowing that far. But Jesus says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Yeah, clearly everyone's going to be okay with this now. But we as the readers, we suddenly realize the mystery has become clearer. Jesus wasn't lost. Jesus wasn't late. Jesus wasn't wondering how he was going to get to them. He was doing something the disciples never imagined was possible. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And he just walked across that water. Nobody had that on the schedule. It wasn't on their list of possible explanations, top 10 ways in which Jesus might get to us. It wasn't on their bingo card that day. Yet Jesus did it, even as they begin to cry out. And I think that is one of the things that Scripture keeps teaching us about God, is that God is not limited to the possibilities that we imagine. He's not waiting for us to predict what he could do before he picks what he's going to do. He would never. Who would have predicted that God would save the world through a crucified carpenter of Nazareth? Who would have predicted that the Messiah would conquer death by dying? Who would have predicted that the tomb would be empty? Who would have predicted that the risen Christ would come to frighten disciples in a locked room and say, "Peace be with you"? And who, sitting on that shore, would have predicted that Jesus would simply walk across the water to catch up with the disciples? Because God does things that we don't expect. He's allowed to. And that means there will always be mysteries about God that we cannot solve. But notice what Jesus does with his disciples. Okay. He doesn't tell them, "Stop the boat, stay here until you understand everything and that I'm doing, and then you can go ahead and pick up again." He doesn't say, "Figure out exactly how I'm going to get to you through the storm before you continue." He says, "Go. Trust me." And that's where Peter comes in. We give him a hard time. But you see, Peter sees Jesus walking on the water. He says, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus says, "Come." How often is it that we say, "God, if this is what you want, let me know," and then we'd actually be willing to do it? Peter gets out of that boat. There's something important about that. Peter didn't just decide that morning, I think I'm going to walk on water today. He doesn't manufacture a miracle through positive thinking. It's not like, I believe in myself and my floatable feet. Peter asks Jesus for a word. "Command me." And Jesus does. "Come." So Peter steps out of the boat because Christ has spoken. And frankly, that's faith. He may have trouble with it. It may sometimes be small, but it's still faith. See, faith is not believing that I can accomplish something impossible if I just believe hard enough or if I understand everything well enough. Faith is trusting the one who spoke it. See, Peter's confidence is not ultimately in Peter. Peter's confidence is ultimately in Jesus. And for a few moments, let's face it, Peter walks. But then he looks at the wind, and he looks at the waves. He becomes afraid, and he begins to sink. And we get judgmental about Peter, and as if the rest of us would have gotten out of that boat, noticing the other disciples didn't. But what does Peter say? Does he say, I need more faith? Does he say, I need to try harder? Does he say, don't worry, I got this? Lord, save me. Isn't that what we should always be doing? Jesus immediately reaches out his hand and takes hold of him. That is the gospel. Peter's faith, it's little, it falters, he sinks, but Jesus saves him. Who does he cry out to? And that brings us back to Romans 10. Because we can spend an enormous amount of time trying to argue questions about things that God has not revealed. What about the person who never heard? What about someone who was taught something else? What about the person who never really understood Jesus or all the mysteries surrounding the judgment? And we can keep asking those questions until we have constructed some elaborate machinery to try to explain something that Scripture never really explained. But eventually, we have to come back to what Jesus actually told us. Paul says, how are they to call on him in whom they have not believed? How are they to believe in whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? Faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. And that is what we know. We know that Christ saves. We know that Christ has commanded his gospel to be proclaimed to everyone. We know that people hear the gospel. We know the Spirit creates faith through God's word. We know that we've been entrusted with that proclamation. We don't know every mystery surrounding God's hidden work, but we know what he has given us to do. I want you to imagine you're watching someone driving a car at an incredible speed toward the edge of a cliff. You see the cliff, you see the car, you know what's about to happen, and you start shouting, stop, don't keep driving, you're heading toward the cliff. Now imagine someone standing beside you, there's always that one friend, saying, well, if they didn't hear you, perhaps there's a cable hidden somewhere that will catch the car, maybe. Perhaps there's some mechanism you don't know about. Perhaps someone actually put a parachute into that car. Perhaps there's some other possibility you don't see. Would you stand there and say, well, since there might be some mysterious mechanism that I don't know about, I guess there's really no reason to warn the driver? Of course not. Unless you're crazy. You know the way to save that person. Tell them to stop. You don't need to know every possible thing that might happen. You know what you have been given to do. And that is something of what Paul is saying. We don't proclaim Christ because we've solved every mystery of God's sovereignty. We proclaim Christ because Christ commanded us to do it. We don't know everything God is doing, but we do know that that is where salvation lies. That is where salvation exists. What he has revealed is enough to give us our mission. But there's something else to consider too. Sometimes we assume that because we don't understand how God could possibly work, God might not actually be doing that work after all. Matthew 14 deprives us of that arrogance. The disciples did not know how Jesus was going to get across the lake. They could not have imagined the answer. Let's just not go until we understand everything that God is doing. But suddenly there he was. Not when they were waiting for him on the shore, but coming to them across the water as they had followed. The disciples could not have imagined the resurrection either, but the tomb was still empty. They could not have imagined God bringing salvation through a cross, but the cross was still the place where God accomplished redemption. They couldn't have imagined how Christ could conquer death, but he still did it. So perhaps there are things about God's work that we don't understand, and frankly, that should make us humble. It should not make us hopeless. Because the God who does things that we cannot imagine is also the God who has given us a promise that we can trust. The promise of grace and forgiveness in His Son and His sacrifice. There's a beautiful distinction between God's hidden work and His revealed work. There are things that God has hidden from us, but we don't pull back the curtain to try to find the wizard in Oz. God has revealed Himself already in Jesus. And when we want to know who God is, we look there. We don't climb into heaven to look for extra opportunities for grace. We don't descend into the abyss because we need to fix this whole crucified Jesus thing. We don't search for secret knowledge. We don't need alternate paths. We look to Christ. And Christ comes to us through His Word. And that's why the church preaches. That's why the missionaries go. That's why the parents teach their children. That's why the Christians tell their neighbors. That's why we gather around the Scriptures. That's why we need all of you involved in the ministry here. Because we don't want people to have to guess who God is. We want them to hear. And how are they to hear without someone preaching? The answer is they can't. And even more than that, the very thing that changes our hearts, the rebellious ones, into being people who actually embrace God, that comes through the Word itself. Our hearts need more than just a message. They need the power of God through that Word to change them, to reform them, to kill off the old and to bring them to the new. And that only happens as God proclaims His Word through us. He sends His church, He sends His people, He sends the gospel, and He puts the words into our mouth. And through that creates faith. You know, there was one time where I was still on the crazy phone, and I tried to go from Illinois into St. Louis. But the iPhone, for some reason, sent me through East St. Louis instead of keeping me on the freeway. If you know anything about East St. Louis, you know you do not want to be driving there unless you have to. And there were about a dozen people standing around a giant barrel with fire coming out of it and someone's front yard, and I still have no idea why, and I did not stick around to find out. But fortunately, while I did not understand why the iPhone sent me there, I did finally make my way through and get home. There are always times where we come across something that leaves us wondering. There are questions we can't understand. There are things about God's sovereignty that are mysterious. And there are always moments where we look at the storm and say, where's Jesus? Moments in our circumstances where we say, I don't understand what God is doing. But our faith doesn't require that we understand everything about God. It asks us to trust the God who has already revealed Himself. And so with Peter, we just say, Lord, save me. As Jesus says, come. We don't know what tomorrow's going to look like. We don't know if the water's going to hold us, and we don't know when and how God is going to solve the problems. Any of them. The mystery for now looks unresolved, but Christ is still saying, come. We know who conquered death. We know who rose from the grave. And we know who has promised that whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So we don't have to find some alternate path to God or some alternate path to conquer the problems of this world. Christ has already died, risen, and brought His word to us. So go. Go and proclaim what you do know. Go and tell people. Go and make disciples. Let them hear, because we may not know everything that God is doing, but we know what He has done. And we know the one who is with us. So when the wind is against us, we keep going. When the waves are high, we keep going. When we don't understand, we keep going. And when our faith is little, we keep going. When we sink, we cry out, Lord, save me. Because where else will we find salvation? And the hand that reaches for us is the same one extended on the cross. The one who walked across the water is the one who walked out of the tomb. And the one who says, come, says, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. So we may not know everything, but we do know Christ. And we know who he truly is and that he wants all people to know him. And for today, that is enough. Thanks be to God.